When Judge Thomas Bennett stepped onto the jet bridge, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that demanded no attention. His first-class ticket was folded neatly in his hand, and under the warm cabin lights, his polished Oxfords clicked softly against the aisle floor. He was a black man well into his 60s, a veteran of the federal bench, whose keen mind had shaped landmark decisions on civil rights. Today he simply sought a peaceful flight home, unaware how swiftly prejudice would turn courtesy into contempt. As Judge Bennett settled into seat 1A, the atmosphere in the cabin was calm until Sarah Mitchell, the lead flight attendant, swept in like a storm cloud. Under the cabin's regulated air set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, her posture was perfect, her crisp uniform unblemished, but her eyes flickered with a cold calculation as she approached his row. Without greeting, she demanded his boarding pass, her voice sterile as a courtroom reprimand. Each syllable was punctuated with an unspoken question. How dare he occupy space meant for those she deemed worthy? When she held his pass in her hand, she stared at it as if decoding a secret, her lips curving into a patronizing smile that stung worse than any slap. Nearby passengers leaned in, curiosity shimmering in their eyes as they watched the unfolding drama. Then, in a slow, measured voice that dripped with condescension, she said, "Seat 1A was not his," and ordered him to economy. Her words sliced through the cabin's quiet like a blade. The judge's calm mask cracked for a fraction of a second as he gathered his briefcase and rose, leaving a trail of stunned silence behind. At that moment, every eye in the cabin tracked his path. The gentle click of magazine pages ceased, and the hum of hushed chatter died out entirely. Thomas Bennett walked with the stoic grace of a man who had faced prejudice his entire life, but his heart thundered in his chest as the gravity of the insult sank in. Even the metal armrest felt cold and unwelcoming beneath his hand, a stark reminder of how swiftly dignity can be stripped away. His pride remained intact, but a heavy ache of wounded innocence weighed on his soul. Seated in the cramped economy row, Bennett stowed his worn leather bag beneath the seat in front of him, feeling the confines press against his knees like a vice. His world had shrunk from the plush first-class cabin with its 24 inches of legroom to this narrow 6-inch space, but his resolve did not falter. He placed a gentle hand on the armrest, reminding himself that his battle was not only personal, but symbolic. He unlocked his smartphone with deliberate care and tapped out a brief message to his clerk. First-class removal, reason, racial bias, no explanation. A second text to the executive response team set the wheels of retribution turning. Moments later, the intercom crackled with an unexpected summons. "Sarah Mitchell, please report to the cockpit." Her steps faltered. No member of the cabin crew answered a mid-flight call without dread. She smoothed her uniform, straightened her name tag, and approached the cockpit door, each tap of her heels echoing like a guilty heartbeat. Inside, Captain Larson faced her with measured calm. He laid out the facts. She had removed a federal judge without cause. Legal was watching, the executive team was waiting, and the CEO demanded action. Rachel's cheeks burned as the weight of disgrace settled in. She had prided herself on professionalism, yet she had let bias rule her judgment. "What do you want me to do?" she stammered. The captain's reply was cold and clinical. Return him to first class, issue an apology, and prepare a written statement for headquarters. With that, Rachel's world upended in a single breath. She turned away and exited the cockpit, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Sarah Mitchell's heart was racing as she hurried down the aisle, her usual composure slipping away like sand through her fingers. She forced a polite smile, but her palms were damp and the back of her neck felt aflame. Every step toward the economy section echoed with the memory of the captain's orders. She had to make this right, and fast. Sarah retreated to the galley, her steps heavy and uneven. She tried to straighten cups on trays that were already perfectly aligned, hoping the motion would steady her trembling hands. Around her, the other attendants exchanged furtive glances. Young Emma Carter lingered at the doorway, her sympathy evident in the tight line of her mouth. Clara stood with arms crossed, her silence more accusing than any words. Judge Bennett sat forward in first class, the cushion pressing against his back, his book left untouched in his lap. He gazed out the window at 9,000 feet of blue sky, reflecting on how easily dignity could be stripped away by a single glance. His phone buzzed against the leather seat beside him. Internal review initiated, CEO looped in, action pending upon landing. He tapped the message away without emotion, oozed her eyes for a heartbeat and nodded. He's a senior federal judge. The weight of Clara's words pressed on her like a stone. She had assumed he was just another traveler. Her mistake. It was more than that. Clara's tone softened but stayed firm. He didn't yell or shout at you. He simply walked away, then came back in silence. It was that calm that unsettled everyone. Sarah couldn't speak. The silence cracked around her. Back in first class, Bennett's phone chimed again. Direct action upon landing, formal apology, and crew review. He put it aside, feeling neither triumph nor anger. He sought accountability, not spectacle. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines settle into the background. Passengers shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others offering small nods of solidarity. The middle-aged man in the gray blazer across the aisle caught Bennett's eye and gave a slight bow of his head, a silent apology on behalf of everyone who had looked away. Sarah hovered by the curtain separating cabins, listening to the muted conversations. She felt the weight of every look, every unspoken judgment pressing against her back. She knew the reckoning waiting at the gate would be far harsher than any in-fleet reprimand. The cabin's atmosphere had changed irrevocably. What had been polite service was now an uneasy tension, as palpable as the recycled air around them. Even the steady drone of the engines seemed to carry a note of warning. No injustice goes unanswered. High above the clouds, Judge Thomas Bennett sat with a quiet dignity restored. His briefcase lay by his feet, his poetry book closed, and his expression calm. He had faced bias in countless courtrooms, but this small victory, his seat regained, his honor protected, felt like justice served. And for those who had witnessed it, there would be no forgetting how swiftly one act of prejudice could unleash a wave of accountability. At 1,000 feet, the runway burst into view through a patch of morning mist, but beneath the cockpit's steady landing commands, a storm brewed in the cabin. Sarah emerged from the restroom, shoulders slumped, hair slightly mussed. She avoided mirrors now, each reflection a reminder of her irreversible error. As she passed through the curtain, Clara's gaze pinned her in place. There was no pity there, only the unspoken question, how could you? Sarah shuffled to her jump seat, the laminated safety placard offering cold comfort. 10 seconds to touchdown, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. 10 seconds to face the storm. When the wheels met the tarmac, the gentle thud reverberated through the fuselage and into every passenger's soul. No one stirred. Instead, they sat in hushed tableau, some with hands clasped, others rubbing their palms against jeans as though they could wipe away the stain of prejudice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the engines powered down and the overhead lights brightened to full. She braced herself against the galley wall, throat dry, hands icy. Less than 15 seconds later, the door at the front hissed open, and the cabin door slid aside to reveal 2 uniformed security officers. They moved with calm precision, stepping into the aisle. The passengers parted like a silent sea, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Sarah felt each gaze burn into her back as she was asked to step forward. Her uniform felt like a costume she no longer fit. She raised her chin, an instinctive act of defiance, but her legs trembled. Behind her, Clara watched with impassive eyes. In that moment, every tray Sarah had ever balanced, every late-night shift she had worked, seemed to vanish beneath the weight of this single act. The lead officer approached, hand extended in what he believed was a courtesy. Sarah hesitated, an instant that rippled through the cabin. Then she took his hand and allowed herself to be led away. Passengers exhaled collectively, the tension breaking like a snapped cord. Some murmured, "Thank you, Judge Bennett," while others simply nodded at his serene figure in 1A. Thomas Bennett remained seated until the security team paused at his row. He stood and accepted their escort without a word, his movements measured, his head held high. He gave a slight nod to the captain as the cockpit door swung open, then moved past Sarah, whose eyes met his for a fleeting second. That look, calm, unwavering, just was more satisfying than any dramatic outburst. It spoke volumes. Prejudice would not stand unchallenged, and dignity, once wounded, could still rise with quiet conviction. As the cabin door closed behind Sarah and Judge Bennett walked toward his waiting car, the passengers broke into soft applause, not out of mockery, but out of solidarity. They had witnessed the fall of bias and the ascent of justice, and for them, that moment would linger far beyond the final boarding card being collected. It was a reckoning served cold, and to Judge Thomas Bennett, a victory earned with grace. The cabin was hushed after the captain's thank you echoing through the intercom. Sarah Mitchell glanced toward the cockpit, searching for guidance, but the pilots remained impassive. Then the door swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and brilliant white light spilled in from the jet bridge. A sharply dressed man in a plain black suit stepped through first, his eyes narrow and serious. He was flanked by a uniformed security officer and a third person holding a tablet labeled Internal Affairs, Horizon Air. Sarah's stomach twisted as the man in the suit acknowledged the captain before turning toward Clara. "We're here for 2 matters," he said quietly. "First, we'll escort Judge Bennett off the aircraft, then we'll speak with your lead attendant." The security officer advanced down the aisle, each step deliberate. Passengers straightened in their seats, no longer feigning disinterest. Judge Bennett remained seated, his posture as composed as ever. When the officer reached 1A, he paused and offered a respectful nod. "Sir, we're ready when you are." Bennett closed his briefcase lid with calm precision, stood and adjusted his suit jacket, creating soft folds of navy wool. He gave the cabin one last thoughtful look before walking past, briefcase in hand, every inch the dignified jurist he was. No one spoke as he passed. Some passengers bowed their heads slightly. An elderly woman murmured, "He handled that with class." At the entrance, Sarah instinctively stepped forward, lips parted as if to apologize, but Bennett did not look her way. He exited without a word, his silence cutting deeper than any speech. The suited investigator turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, please bring your crew identification and pass. You will be escorted to the operations room for a preliminary review." Sarah felt her knees go weak. Clara gave a curt nod and moved aside, her eyes cool as steel. Sarah crossed the cabin on trembling legs, each step echoing behind her like a judgment. She passed Bennett's empty seat, noticing the headrest still creased where he had rested. Where a man had paid to sit, she had banished him. Now she walked away, unable to meet any eyes, haunted by every glance. At the gate, Judge Bennett was met by 2 senior executives. One extended his hand, eyes apologetic. "Judge Bennett, on behalf of Horizon Air, I offer our sincerest apologies." The grip of Bennett's hand was firm and direct. "I appreciate your words," he replied quietly. "This is not about me." He paused and glanced back at the aircraft, its nose nestled against the terminal. It seemed oblivious to the storm she had created. Sarah emerged from the jet bridge under the guard of Internal Affairs and uniformed security. A flash of cameras lit the terminal, and reporters swarmed her with questions. "Did you know he was a federal judge? Why did you remove him? Can you comment on the discrimination claims?" She shrank back, her eyes wide, her shoulders hunched. She remained silent, hurrying past the chargers and luggage carts, wishing the polished floor would swallow her whole. By morning, her name would be splashed across every news site. But it was not job loss that terrified her most. It was the realization that her moment of bias would now be on public display. Every carefully maintained policy, every fiber of authority in her uniform had been shattered in one reckless decision. She had revealed her true self to the world. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett stood beyond the gangway, flanked by airline counsel and a personal assistant. He declined offers for a limousine or hotel accommodations. He needed no preferential treatment. He simply raised an eyebrow at the well-meaning assistant's offer of water and said, "Thank you, but I'll find my own way." He stood firm, a quiet monument to justice in motion. In a back corridor conference room, Sarah sat at a long table under harsh fluorescent lights. Her crew badge lay on the table like an indictment. Across from her sat two investigators, one from Human Resources, the other from Legal Compliance. The legal investigator, Robert Klein, pressed a button on his tablet and the screen's red recording light blinked on. "Ms. Mitchell, this is a formal inquiry into Flight 714. Do you acknowledge that you removed a first-class passenger despite his valid ticket?" Sarah's voice trembled as she managed a scratchy "yes." Klein's gaze locked onto hers. "Did you verify his manifest or consult the gate agent?" "No," she stammered. "I doubted it was authentic. It did not match my expectations." Klein's expression hardened. "What expectations?" Sarah closed her eyes. He did not look like someone who belonged up front. Silence filled the room before Klein leaned forward. "Let me be clear. You removed a federal judge from his seat without cause, in a public humiliation witnessed by dozens. You bypassed protocol and humiliated him. That is beyond a policy breach. It is a question of public trust." Sarah's throat tightened as tears pooled, but she blinked them back. I thought I was doing my duty," she whispered. Klein's tone grew colder. "The issue is that you judged who he was not who he was." The Human Resources investigator tapped her notebook. "A discrimination complaint has been filed. This incident is under review for termination." Sarah closed her eyes, images of 10 years of flawless service flashing through her mind. Every commendation, every untimed turnaround unraveled in that moment of prejudice. She straightened her shoulders and braced her hands on the table. "May I speak with him?" she asked suddenly. Klein shook his head. "That is beyond our control." Back in the quieter terminal lounge, Judge Bennett waited alone at a small table with a glass of water and his folded poetry book. He refused to call a lawyer or welcome the PR team's prepared statements. He preferred silence. He looked out at the passengers milling by, their eyes drifting toward him. Then his phone buzzed. "Formal apology draft approved, statement to be released tonight." He tucked it away, undisturbed. At last, the first press statements rolled out, praising Bennett's restraint and condemning discrimination. Headlines read, "Federal Judge Faces Down Bias with Dignity and Justice Served at 30,000 Feet." By dawn, "Respect the Bench" trended on social media. Sarah Mitchell's name trended too, but in headlines about arrogance and prejudice, she remained seated in that sterile room, awaiting her fate. Judge Thomas Bennett rose and walked through the terminal, each step echoing a silent victory. He had faced bias without lowering his voice or raising a hand. He had demanded accountability through quiet resolve. As he passed the gate, he offered a small nod to the officers who had escorted him. They returned his gesture with respect, and for all who watched, the message was clear: dignity endures, prejudice falters, and justice, when served with grace, never goes unnoticed. Thomas Bennett's phone buzzed again, and he glanced down at the screen. His assistant at the courthouse had sent a quick update. Public statement from Horizon Air expected in 2 hours. Internal affairs review in progress. Media has caught wind. Your comment requested. He stared at those words for a long moment, tracing the worn leather of his case. Then he tapped out a reply. "This is not about me. It is about the cost of mistaking bias for authority. He set his phone face down and looked across the executive lounge, where life flowed on as though nothing had happened. As he waited, his phone dinged with an incoming call from Chief Justice Eleanor Brooks. He answered and heard her steady voice. "Thomas, we've all seen the reports. You handled it with restraint. Most folks would have made a scene." He allowed himself a faint smile. "And what good would that have done?" he asked. She paused and replied, "It would have given them an excuse to dismiss you. Instead, you chose silence, and they filled that gap with fear." He nodded, even though she could not see him, and closed the call, feeling a quiet resolve bloom in his chest. Not long after, Robert Klein and a human resources investigator returned to inform Sarah Mitchell of her fate. Klein carried a printed folder and a sealed envelope. "Miss Mitchell," he began, "following senior management's review, you are suspended from your position effective immediately. You will attend a formal hearing within 5 business days. In the meantime, you may not enter airline premises or contact anyone from Flight 714. Sarah's fingers clenched into fists, her nails cutting into her palms. She did not argue. Words had abandoned her the moment she understood how irrevocable her error had been. That afternoon, Horizon Air issued a brief public statement. "We acknowledge an incident involving a prominent passenger who faced inappropriate treatment by a senior crew member. We condemn discrimination under any circumstances and are conducting a full investigation." But the world had already shaped its own narrative. Videos, recorded by a college student in business class, had spread across social media, gathering more than 4 million views in under 2 days. Talk shows debated protocol. Aviation experts dissected the policy breaches. Legal analysts pointed to systemic bias in service industries. Meanwhile, back in her small apartment near the airport, Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen counter reading a terse note that had appeared in her inbox. The subject line simply said, "Accountability, Ms. Mitchell." And the body quoted him directly, "This report is meant for you, between you and your conscience, Judge Thomas Bennett." She read it 3 times, each pass slower than the last. She folded the email and laid it beside a mug of cold coffee. She did not cry. She did not rip it up. She did not call a friend. Instead, she sat down in the stillness and, for perhaps the first time since that flight, stopped trying to justify herself, even in her own mind. A week later, the world of aviation moved on. New flights departed, some were delayed, travelers griped about weather and connections. To the casual airport commuter, Flight 714 was a fleeting headline, another viral story in a cycle of outrage. But inside Horizon Air's glass-walled headquarters, the narrative was far from over. Senior executives, legal counsel, human resource actives, public relations officers, and operations leaders gathered around a long oak table. At the head sat Michael Sterling, the CEO of Horizon Air, his hands folded and brows furrowed. An operations director pointed out that no one could predict long-term impact, but consensus formed quickly around a decisive course correction. Michael Sterling looked around the table and said, "I want every crew member in this company retrained, every single one, from top to bottom. This training must cover protocol and perception. We cannot let any employee make decisions based on appearance ever again." Heads nodded in agreement. "We were fortunate that Judge Bennett chose dignity over a scene," Sterling added. "We may not be so lucky next time." That same afternoon at a modest high school auditorium in the city, Judge Bennett stepped onto the stage to speak at a youth leadership event. He was introduced simply as a federal judge, but he felt neither pomp nor pressure. His audience was a mix of students, teachers, and parents seated in folding chairs beneath fluorescent lights. He rested his hands on the wooden podium and looked out over the crowd. "I was asked to vacate a seat I had paid for without explanation or justification," he began, his voice steady and calm. He paused to let that sink in. "I chose not to raise my voice," he continued, "because too often shouting in spaces not designed to listen only invites further silencing. Instead, I waited, and with a single call, I set in motion a response that exposed a quiet failure, a collective failure to question our assumptions before acting. Sometimes power is shown not by how loudly you speak, but by what you choose to withhold. The audience absorbed his words in silence. Some students blinked, others nodded slowly. As he left the lecture hall, students offered quiet thanks. Outside, Sarah Mitchell sent her draft apology via the airline's secure portal. She hit send with trembling fingers, hoping her words would serve as a mirror rather than a shield. And so, in a world too often echoing with loud injustices, it was the silence and the actions that followed that resonated the most. She closed her eyes and recalled sliding that boarding pass back into her pocket, believing her instincts were infallible. "I saw him and doubted him in a heartbeat," she admitted. "I made him walk through economy in front of 30 strangers. I humiliated him." The therapist gave her a moment of silence before saying, "You cannot undo what happened, but you can choose how to carry it forward." That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. She did not compose a statement for PR or corporate approval. Instead, she began typing directly to Thomas Bennett. "You owe me nothing," she wrote, "but I owe you the truth. I saw you, judged you by your skin, and assumed you did not belong. That assumption was born of my bias, not your ticket or your conduct. I humiliated you with certainty and confidence in front of others, yet you remained silent. Your silence spoke more truth than any defense I could offer. It showed me who I had become. I don't have all the answers yet, but I am committed to spending my life regretting this choice and changing because of it." With a shaking hand, she clicked send. 2 weeks later, in his sunlit study lined with law tomes, Judge Bennett read her apology. The morning light slanted through tall windows, and he sat in a leather armchair, a fresh cup of coffee warming his hand. He felt the sincerity in every word, as though her confession was not for headlines but for the fragile human bond they now shared. He typed his reply, "Miss Mitchell, I accept your apology not for my sake but for yours. May you never stop on the path of self-improvement." And just like that, he set his phone aside and exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And for Sarah, the woman who once judged too quickly, her journey had just begun. She rose each morning not as a flight attendant but as a mentor, guiding others to see beyond appearances. For Judge Thomas Bennett, dignity had never required a spectacle, only the restraint to stand quietly and let truth speak for itself. In a world too often drowned by noise, it was that silence and the accountability it inspired that proved most unforgettable. Judge Thomas Bennett's dignified silence on Flight 714 did more than reclaim a seat. It exposed a deep prejudice that had simmered beneath the surface. When Sarah Mitchell ordered him to move from first class without cause, her sharp gaze and clipped words sounded like a verdict. Yet in that moment of cruelty, he held on to his composure. His single phone call brought swift justice. She lost her position, faced internal review, and became the subject of a public reckoning. That was the first ripple of his response, a powerful reminder that respect cannot be taken lightly. In the hours that followed landing, Horizon Air's executives scrambled to contain the fallout. The CEO demanded immediate retraining for every crew member, focusing not only on seat assignments but on unconscious bias and fair treatment. Passengers who had witnessed the event shared their videos across social media, and the hashtag Judge714 trended with messages of outrage and support. It was a fitting counterpunch. The truth, once unleashed, could not be smothered by policy or procedure. Sarah's fall from grace was as public as her mistake. No longer clad in crisp navy and gold, she stepped into therapy and then into an apology delivered directly to Judge Bennett's inbox. She admitted, "I saw you and judged you by your appearance. That decision was mine alone." His reply was brief yet profound. "I accept your apology, not because I need it, but because you do." In that exchange, The real victory played out, not in headlines, but in the quiet restoration of dignity. Back at home, Judge Bennett's days returned to their familiar rhythm. Chambers by morning, courtroom decisions by afternoon, evenings spent with his well-worn poetry collection and a 16-ounce mug of coffee. Letters piled on his desk, thank you notes from civil rights groups, invitations to speak at universities, and personal reflections from strangers reminded him that his calm had sparked a national conversation. He hadn't sought revenge, he'd simply refused to give in to anger. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell made a choice that defined her own redemption. She turned down PR scripts and company-sponsored counseling, opting instead to volunteer at a local community center. There, she coached young adults on job interviews and public speaking, sharing the hard lesson that fairness requires action, not just intention. In a small classroom, she explained, "Sometimes we punish others for imagined slights. True courage comes when we admit our mistake and choose compassion instead." Airports across the country took note. Horizon's bias awareness seminars became industry standard, rolled out at hubs from Atlanta to Seattle. Flight attendants learned to verify boarding passes meticulously, but more importantly, to question their own assumptions. Boarding gates installed kiosks inviting passengers to report discrimination directly to an ethics committee. First-class lounges displayed posters reminding staff that every traveler deserves dignity, whether paying hundreds or thousands of dollars for a seat. In corporate boardrooms, the Flight 714 incident became a case study in crisis management and moral leadership. Executives debated how one man's silence had spoken louder than any protest. They realized that policies alone could not prevent injustice. Culture had to shift. Companies began auditing customer service interactions, tracking not just on-time departures but passenger satisfaction, with surveys probing whether travelers felt respected and valued on every leg of their journey. At community colleges and law schools, sociology and ethics professors assigned the Flight 714 story as required reading. Students debated the nuances. Did Judge Bennett's status give him unique leverage? Yes, but they noted that even ordinary citizens could exercise similar power by documenting unfair treatment and holding institutions accountable. They discussed how prejudice lurked in everyday decisions, in grocery stores, doctors' offices, and even on neighborhood streets, and how each person must guard against it. For Judge Bennett, the lasting impact was personal. He continued to preside over trials and write opinions, but now every courtroom exchange carried the echo of Flight 714. He felt a deeper empathy for those who faced bias without resources. In chambers, he mentored younger judges and clerks, urging them always to listen first and judge later. His story spoke not of vengeance, but of the transformative power of quiet resolve. And for Sarah Mitchell, the journey was ongoing. Her apology to Judge Bennett was only the beginning. She set up a small scholarship in his name to support students studying criminal justice and social equity. Each year she sent a check, remembering how one call had changed her life. She attended workshops on cultural competency, leaned into uncomfortable conversations, and rebuilt her identity on humility rather than authority. By the time the one-year anniversary of Flight 714 arrived, public memory had softened, replaced by new headlines and fresh scandals. Yet the core lesson endured. Prejudice is a quiet enemy, and only deliberate reflection and restraint can defeat it. True revenge, the story revealed, is not about striking back, but about insisting that injustice carries a cost. When authority missteps, accountability must follow, swift, fair, and unyielding. Judge Bennett's final words at a national conference on civil rights captured the enduring truth. We are all passengers on the same journey. When one of us is forced from our place, we all lose a bit of our dignity. Let us speak up, not with anger, but with unwavering commitment to justice. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is a choice we cannot afford. His message resonated far beyond the lecture hall, reminding America that respect belongs to those who earn it, and that even the smallest act of bias can spark a movement for change.